Good afternoon or morning, depending on where you are in the country. We're gonna let people continue to trickle in, and we'll get started with our formal program at about 12:02. Thank you for joining us. All right, it is 12:02. So although people are still joining us, we're going to go ahead and get this show on the road. Thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar, Building Equity and Market Strength in Legacy Cities, Context-Driven Equitable Development. This is the second in our two-part series on private development programs for weak market areas, thinking about how to bring equity and affordability in places where you can't make the same requirements of developers that you can in strong market areas. My name is Jessie Grogan, and I'm the Associate Director for Reduced Poverty and Spatial Inequality at the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. For those of us who know Lincoln, you'll probably know our slogan is finding answers in land. And it's exactly that credo that led us to working in legacy cities in the first place. In these places, which Lincoln defines as cities that have lost more than 20% of their population from peak to trough, and that have a higher poverty rate than the national poverty rate, having a large amount of land is often one of the major challenges that policymakers face, but it's also an incredible asset that can be an engine for creativity and lead to revitalization in its own right. Smaller cities, though, in particular, have all of these challenges and all of these opportunities, but lack the capacity that many leaders need in order to take these creative approaches and turn land into its full potential. So that's where Lincoln has come in and focused our work on legacy cities through our Legacy Cities initiative. We feel like we're uniquely poised to help smaller legacy cities reach their potential using land and land-related policies as a key driver. So the Legacy Cities Initiative, which was launched in 2020, offers leaders and practitioners in legacy cities access to cutting-edge research on revitalization strategies that will work in their kinds of places, including one that our friends at the Greater Ohio Policy Center put out a couple of years ago on strategies for bringing equity into revitalization efforts. And we'll post the link to that in the chat as well. We also offer leaders tools and access to educational activities like this one. And finally, connecting through networks and peer learning opportunities. Leaders realize that they're not just inventing the wheel in isolation, but that they are part of a web of folks who are dealing with common challenges and coming up with creative and exciting solutions on their own. So if you are interested in learning more about our network opportunities, you should sign up for the Legacy Cities newsletter, which again will be posted in the chat how you can do that. So as I mentioned, we're particularly concerned with making sure that legacy cities revitalize in ways that promote equity and sustainability. We think that a city that looks more affluent, but where that doesn't translate to affluence for all of its residents, has really only done part of its job. So we think that we need to help leaders pay particular attention to lifting all residents of a city and not just bringing in, the new knowledge workers or whatever the revitalization strategy du jour may be. So as I mentioned, our friends at Greater Ohio, we've been working with them over the last few years to put together strategies. There was the policy focus report that I mentioned, and they also put together a working paper on strategies for revitalization in weak marketplaces, which is led to the webinar series that you see today. You can access both of those through the links in the chat, and the links will also be sent out in the follow-up email to this webinar. So now I'm very excited to hand the reins to our content providers for this time around. Following me will be our moderator, Robbie Suggs, who is the Chief Lending Officer at the Cincinnati Development Fund, a CDFI that provides real estate lending for underserved markets in Cincinnati. Oh geez, I just lost my bio. Ms. Suggs is responsible for all lending-related activity, including loan processing, underwriting, construction management, and credit risk and asset management. She builds and maintains strong relationships with developers, nonprofits, business owners, and financial partners to originate, underwrite, and close loans in support of CDF's mission and resident-driven community plans. She came to CDF from First Financial Bank, where she was a vice president of strategic partnerships, economic development, and credit outreach. She is going to take you through a fantastic discussion today. So with that, I'll hand it to Robbie. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jessie. This is a very interesting topic, and I'm so excited to be moderating it today. And also thank you to the Lincoln Institute for your commitment to legacy cities. I'm excited to be here today and have a conversation with 3 private developers working in a space with weak market strength, who are considering equity as a component of their business operational strategies. Our speakers will discuss private development within the context of weak marketplaces and share their experience with building development companies, getting projects done, and building market strength in places of historically little market rate development. Before we get started, I'd like to go through some housekeeping. We ask that you please keep your cameras off and your volume muted when you are during the seminar. We have 10 minutes set aside for you to do the Q&A later. And if you have a question that you'd like to ask, which I know you will, please use the Q&A at the bottom of your screen to ask your questions. We will be monitoring those and we can ask those as we go on. We will be recording this webinar and it will be available afterwards on the Lincoln Institute website. Audience members will receive an email from Lincoln Institute when their materials are available. I'm excited now to kick this webinar off. This is, again, a very interesting topic. And it's some of the things that we work with here in Cincinnati. I think it's not an individual city. I think it's a global situation. We will run this webinar as an informal discussion to allow our panelists a chance to interact and share their experience with the audience. Let me take a moment to introduce our panelists. First, I'm happy to welcome Shannon Morgan, Managing Partner of Equitable Development in Detroit, Michigan. Shannon, would you please represent yourself by introduction?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Shannon Morgan. I'm with Renovare Development based in Detroit, Michigan, and we are a woman-owned social impact development company that are working statewide, both in the rural context and in urban main streets to develop and build projects that serve deep community need. And so we often work in extremely complicated capital stacks with a host of community partners. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to next go to Brian Potts.
Hi, everyone. I'm Brian. I'm the managing partner of a company called the Ridgewood Group LLC. We are based in Springfield, Ohio. For those of you not familiar, Springfield is a city of about 60,000 people, somewhat equidistant between Dayton, Ohio and Columbus, Ohio. We're an early industrial city with a lot of old housing stock, and what we focus on here is value add real estate investment on residential properties, usually single family homes and smaller apartment complexes, with the focus of renting those properties out to generally existing residents here in Springfield.
Thank you, Brian. Ryan, would you go next, please?
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ryan Bates. I own Bates Development, which is a Louisiana-based minority-owned real estate development company. We focus on ground-up and adaptive reuse multifamily apartments. I also have done some work with short-term rental hotel, and as of recently, looking at student housing opportunities. We really work in the private development sector, but sometimes venture out with municipalities, using additional housing stock through housing authorities or redevelopment authorities. And a lot of our work is around tax incentive development with historic tax credits, new markets, and low-income housing tax credits.
Welcome to all of you, and thank you for your time today. I'd like to start this discussion with how you get a market ready for development as a private developer. You work in places that have, where the strength is very weak and spotty. Can you take a little bit of time to discuss the programmatic and policy work of municipal governments or other local actors like CDCs has successfully decreased the risk of private development? That's one of the things that we, have a lot of CDCs here in Cincinnati, and they do tend to support that work. So I would like each one of you to sort of talk about who you're working with to make these things happen and how those have benefited or caused challenges in the work you're doing. Shannon, could you go first, please?
Absolutely. Certainly a statement that's near and dear to my heart. One of the things we do look for is local collaboration within a municipality and the projects that we're working in. And Michigan has an amazing program through the Michigan Economic Development Corporation called Redevelopment Ready Communities. The Redevelopment Ready Community programs, from a policy perspective, works with a lot of the local municipalities to streamline their public processes, from entitlement to community engagement to really looking at costs for zoning and reviews. What they also do is work with the local community to prioritize redevelopment sites. So as a developer, we really prioritize that site. That means that our local communities have dug in, they've done the work. They have a strategic plan for public engagement. They've prioritized their community, community level projects to a certain level. And they've created a system that streamlines that to get it through final zoning and entitlement. That's something, as we look at really difficult projects, that is very important to us. If a community is not engaged in that process, then as you said, Robbie, we look to work with local CDFIs, local CDEs, continuums of care, certainly stakeholders that can communicate effectively and create a collaborative partnership to kind of help move projects through the entire process of development.
Thank you, Shannon. Brian, could you share your thoughts?
Sure. Here in Springfield, some of the things, again, I'm somewhat here today talking as more of a, what would be kind of classified as a mom and pop sort of investors. While I own a lot of properties, we all start with one. And oftentimes when we're looking in these markets at existing housing stock, they are oftentimes owned by folks that own 10, 12, 13 rental properties. And I think what municipalities end up dealing with is not knowing how to reach out to these folks. And especially here in Springfield, we're often left looking at what we see here in 2023, and that is a lot of properties that have not been maintained, and you look in their rental properties and you think, well, landlords are the root cause of this issue. And oftentimes it's disinvestment that was the root cause of that issue. Homeowners leaving neighborhoods for various reasons. So here in Springfield, with the help of GOPC, we have started a housing consortium group, which we're in the process of turning into a full nonprofit, and where I have experience working on boards of other nonprofits, but I am mainly there as an investor, trying to work with the city and these other nonprofits of how to reach out to investors, how to work with investors and develop local investors into the type of investors that you want them to be. We all know in the real estate space, there are tons of programs out there to teach people how to be what I would say bad investors, meaning how to purchase properties, how to put as little money into them, and how to maximize your profits. And I think we're looking here more holistically. How do we start over? How do we change the narrative? In a city like Springfield, where 50 to 60% of the residents here are tenants, which means we're not going to solve that with home ownership initiatives alone. So we need to look and figure out ways, working with foundations, municipalities, how to incorporate private investors working on these smaller families, smaller multifamily properties and single family homes, how we work and bring them together and kind of change that dynamic.
So Brian, does Springfield have a land bank?
Yes, we do have, it's actually Clark County has the land bank, and they have made some gains here in the last few years where they're actively going after some of these properties, and trying to find ones that still have some life left in them, because what we've seen here is places have sat vacant for 20 years with no investment, and they're really candidates to be torn down. But in a legacy city like Springfield, there's a lot of great architecture here. There's history here, and we're trying not to erase all of that. So the land bank is present, working on that.
Thank you, Brian. Ryan?
Yeah, I think I'll just touch on the fact that as a private developer, we rely heavily on these coalitions, on these housing authorities, on the redevelopment authorities for the larger opportunities. In a city like New Orleans, you've seen a big discrepancy from rental prices to wage increases. So when we look at opportunities, a lot of them have come from land being, dilapidated, not taken care of. That's been a part of the redevelopment authority stock or the city stock. And then the policy that drives those opportunities to keep these for workforce housing, affordable housing, or kind of market rate is a big term to just throw out there, because what you would consider pricing here is, much on a higher end, and pricing a lot of the workforce that would typically not be considered affordable into market rate housing. And so we rely heavily on the policy and opportunities that are driven by these coalitions and the redevelopment authority as our focal point to go and attack for opportunity. And I think that is what helps to the other side of the equation, which is the cost of being able to get these deals done and factoring that in. So it's highly important. I think the efforts are needed. And I think that's where, from a private standpoint, we like to focus on opportunity, especially for multifamily development.
So Ryan, I'm going to stay with you for a moment. You discussed something about getting the financing done. What type of financing tools have you found helpful, and what things do you think would be needed to help you do your job better? So
when we come in, either the land being part of the capital stack, where we can do like a 99-year lease and provide some type of commitments on our end, whether it's a 80% AMI range or higher or lower, kind of a mixed income approach with market rate and workforce housing. We also layer in community development block grant funding. And if we can't get direct financial sources, we like to see incentives such as payment in lieu of taxes for the real estate, some of the permitting fees. We have stormwater management here in New Orleans, which is a big deal given where we are. And so those costs can be astronomical and really just put a strain on the project. So we really like to find ways to get the local government municipality involved with kind of waiving sewer impact water fees, real estate taxes, things of that nature. Really, they may not be direct dollars, but they help on an operational standpoint, which allows us to go get more private dollars to support the development.
Do you have a land bank and do you work with them?
We've worked with the redevelopment authority here, and they really take a lot of the city-owned property and have kind of been the big force around all of the housing stock since Hurricane Katrina. And then a lot of that's done on an RFP process.
Thank you. Brian, could you provide some thoughts about financing?
Was that Brian or Ryan? Were you asking me?
I'm sorry, Brian.
Yes.
Sounds I apologize.
Yeah, so typically how financing works for what we are doing here. I typically work with smaller local banks, and we're working off of commercial loans, 75%, 80% loan to value, which is, again, I'm a value add investor. So oftentimes we're trying to, make the improvements, get appraisals to where they need to be. So ultimately, the less money that comes out of my pocket in the form of a down payment means the more work that I can do. And that, brings up often what we all know to be that dreaded appraisal gap. Meaning where you have more invested in a property than what it's worth. And that is a tough thing to deal with when you're dealing with small one-off folks like myself. So I often see, we talk about like dreams, like what you wish, what products would make things more helpful out there. And that's why I look to like foundations we've been in discussions with, looking for basically gap financing. That could be in the form of actual money. It could be in the form of, on the residential side for buyers, there's programs called, FHA 203K loans that focus on renovation. I see there could be some opportunities there where foundations or even governmental entities could focus on, the envelope of a house, because that makes a big difference. I notice when we're working in neighborhoods, when you get paint and windows and a roof on a place, the neighbors start to notice, they want to come and talk to you and see what's going on. But largely, it is, and I tell people this all the time that are looking into getting into this, it is an expensive business to operate in. So again, to Ryan's point, tax abatements, if available on smaller scales, and I think municipalities have always struggled trying to figure out how to do this on smaller projects. If someone like Shannon or Ryan is bringing a larger development, a brownfield development, something, everybody seems to be able to come to the table and at least try to figure that out. My side of it's a little different, but just as important, because there are houses, single families, small multifamilies that are right across the street from their larger developments that you've got to get those figured out as well. So, it's tough. I can't really say there's a lot out there other than, kind of dreams from what I've seen from this side. And that would be in the form of, again, the gap financing, ways to help subsidize the cost of these developments.
Thank you, Brian. I would like to go a little bit further with that and ask you, so you're saying that you have problems with the gap financing. With the gap financing for you, what would that look like? Would it be, a grant? Would it be a very, very low cost loan? What would that look like for you as far as a gap filler?
So for me personally, I would like to see these as loans. Grants are great, But, I'm a business person. Deals for me need to make sense for everybody that's at the table. And oftentimes, I spoke at one of GOPC's conferences about how I'm working in historic neighborhoods, and how I've actually had a larger impact revitalizing historic properties for rent than we had for sale, because oftentimes folks can't get qualified for loans. This all comes down to risk for banks and ultimately for the home buyers. If the neighborhood is not quote unquote stabilized yet, it could be a risky investment for a homeowner. So when you have income coming in on a property, you might be able to support another 10 or 20% of debt at a reasonable rate paid to municipalities. It could be government. I think foundations could play a big role here with unrestricted funds, because generally foundations are sitting on money that they have invested in, stocks, bonds, things of that nature. They would be able to do loans to properly underwritten investors. That's the big thing, which I'm sure you see on your side too. It's got to make sense for both sides. But yeah, I would like to see them as loans, not grants.
No, thank you. So I appreciate that insight. In Cincinnati, we've been working with our local city government for funding related to affordable housing, and our county related to affordable housing, both for gap filler type of products. And this has been a huge problem. And the fact that the pricing for development has not gone down, it's only accelerated, is just, made everything just worse. So Shannon, could you talk a little bit about how you've been funding your project?
Much like Brian and Ryan, use the same resources, but I'll talk a little bit about some of the new resources that we're seeing from a policy perspective in Michigan. And we, like everyone else, have seen an unprecedented amount of ARP funding and a tremendous amount of new policy initiatives that have been underway for brand new funding sources through our local state agencies. Those funding sources include a statewide missing middle housing fund. They include blight elimination and workforce housing grants to our state land bank. They include a revitalization and placemaking fund to our EDC, which looks at conversions and other opportunities. So we're using a lot of that money is being funneled through priority projects throughout the state. From that, what we're also seeing is local institutions and foundations that are creating specific loan loss reserves and other products that can help really bridge the gaps that we talked about. We're seeing a huge influx of local employers and corporations that are investing in multitudes of different fashions, either through direct investment, through partnerships and tax credit investments. And from a policy initiative here, we have several new initiatives, both with expansion of our brownfield tax increment financing program here in Michigan, but also with an employer earned tax credit that's starting. So most recently, our state housing authority adopted the first ever statewide housing plan, which is an extremely aggressive commitment to produce 75,000 units of housing, in which that is formed to really shape and craft policy to look at these different types of missing middle format of for sale and equitable development of workforce housing. So we are just really becoming engaged in, using these mechanisms. And many times we're looking for all of the above, grants where needed, to low interest loans, to working with foundations and CDFIs to monetize our brownfield TIF funding, to creative resources that will back a loan loss reserve for a project that may be a little bit more challenging.
Shannon, that's awesome. Thank you so much. I want to also remind everyone that you can certainly put something in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to ask a question. Shannon, I'm going to stay with you for just a minute and just ask you about projects that you've done that have been, market rate, and how, or if that has been able to serve the needs of low to moderate income residents, because that's sort of an issue everywhere. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, we do look at mixed income projects with a component of market rate, and we're in an affordable housing or mixed income project for sale right now with the municipality. It's a partnership that we used creative brownfield tax increment financing to fund. And we were able to gap, the market rate side of the units and the costs for that by utilizing that fund. That project is also using ARP dollars through the local county fund to, we're looking at 50% of those that will be 40 to 80% AMI. This is, as I said, a new initiative with one of our local CDFIs that we are monetizing because we don't have, it's a for sale project, we don't have collateral. We're monetizing that brownfield TIF. So, we look for tools, and oftentimes what we call market rate units, we still oftentimes need more creative tools. We still need grants to fill those sources. We need tools that are outside the typical tax credits that we've used to work through the underwriting requirements and to produce what we need. We're in a municipality that needed more for sale housing. This is a housing that is specifically incentivizing local, equity in a high minority population. So we're trying to bridge some of those market rate construction loans with these new tools and funding sources that are coming in.
Thank you, Shannon. Ryan, could you talk a little bit about what you're doing in that space?
Yeah, I think Shannon really hit on that pretty accurately. What we try to do is a mixed income approach, and we'll typically do 80% of the units as affordable, and that affordability will range from deep affordability, like 30% AMI, up to 80%. So we'll do an income averaging, and then 20% of the units will be unrestricted, true market rate. And kind of as I mentioned earlier, you'll notice in some of these areas that 80% AMI is a market rate unit at that point, just given where the pricing is. And so I approach every deal with how do I fill the gap? Because we are in a state right now, specifically Louisiana, where it's not just the construction costs, it's not just the interest rates, but it's also the insurance. The insurance has been a big factor here. Working with a lot of different groups, coalitions, state agencies on how, I mean, we are in a hurricane, just path all the time in Louisiana. So there's the hard side of getting the deals funded, given the cost of the insurance on the operational side, but then more so, that's the opportunity where a lot of the federal dollars have actually come into play because of how many housing stock we've lost since Hurricane Ida, Delta, Rita, Katrina. I mean, it's multiple storms and it's throughout the state of Louisiana. And that's where a lot of the that gap financing kind of comes into play, where we can do a mixed income deal. We can do a cash flow loan that kind of puts a second mortgage on it that's tied to the terms of the first construction of permanent debt. And I think that's really been the savior of these deals at this point. I mean, deals are just not penciling out the same based on the construction, the interest, and the insurance. And so those gap programs, along with Brian and I kind of mentioned earlier, with how do we get some of the tax relief here? How do we get some of the impact fee relief here? All those have been a true mechanism of getting us actually into construction at this point. And so I say we get the blessing and the curse that you got to pay, very handsomely for the insurance, but then the opportunity becomes federal dollars to Louisiana have been allocated in the form of surplus cash flow loans that we really utilize, and then we can create a mixed income that has market rate with affordability in it.
Putting these deals together is not easy.
Not at all. Not at all. It's a lot of trouble, but it's very much so needed. So, I think one thing that we're all here and saying that, we really care and love what we do for our communities. And so you bang your head against the wall several times, but I think I approach every deal at this point as how do we fill the gap?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Ryan. Brian, so from what I understand, you do more single families than you do multi-units. Is that correct in Springfield?
So it's a good mix of, it's actually probably more 50-50. I tend to like to try to operate in some of our historical neighborhoods when possible, because they've been some of the neighborhoods that are harder to figure out. You have very passionate people that live in them that when you talk to them, they say, I have $400,000 invested in this house, and we all know the market value of the house is about 210. That person is not is widely available as those of us that would like to be within market ranges of the properties we're investing in. So it's a little bit of both, but the multifamily properties, oftentimes they're larger, they're bigger, and I do like to keep them multifamily, even if they've been converted, because they help me stabilize that property with the increased cash flow that's there. And it also provides a lower cost of really living expenses for the tenant that's there. The footprint is smaller. Some of these houses are 4,000 square feet. So if they're divided into 4 units, you're dealing with 1,000 square foot cost to maintain for a tenant, as opposed to a 4,000 square foot house, which is again limiting the amount of people that can rent that property. So it's neighborhood specific for us.
Great, thank you. I want to stay with you for just a second, Brian, and just talk a little bit about working with minority developers that are maybe trying to get in the business. And I mean, minority, women-owned, GCs, contractors, to support equity in those areas. Have you seen programs that are supporting minority developers and women-owned businesses in the development space? I know that this has been something that some cities have made it a priority to require a certain number of the vendors to be minorities. Are you finding programs like that in Springfield, or tell me what that looks like?
Yeah, so again, I know those programs exist, but in my kind of ecosphere, not as much, because I'm generally funding, through more traditional means, so I don't have any restrictions placed on me as far as who I can use. But to that point, what we're seeing here in a lot of Springfield is we are seeing a lot of upstart minority-owned type businesses. There's been a large influx of, Hispanic folks here, that many of them have kind of gravitated into the construction place, which honestly has been an absolute blessing for me, because we struggle looking for labor here. So, as far as, any grants or anything associated with that, I don't really see that in my space, but I do know there are programs, and it does exist in more of the, kind of spheres that Ryan and Shannon are working in.
So thank you, Brian. Ryan, you have any thoughts about any type of programs, or are you making any conscious effort to work with minority-owned businesses?
Absolutely. And I think what helps is when the municipalities who, typically they're over these federal dollars and they can mandate DBE percentages and participation. But what helps is when you can lure the private developers who use like the tax abatement programs, that some of these incentives, and say, hey, as a component to getting this, you have to have, a DB participation. And typically they would not have had that forced upon them, but it is a type of resource, a tax abatement that we'll see the economic development groups kind of place within their programs. Louisiana Housing Corporation, who does a lot of the affordable housing tax credits here, has just started to implement points for scoring for funding by JVing with minority developers along with subcontractors and DBE. And I will tell you, it's hard. I mean, coming out initially, that was my hiccup, just the access to financing and capital, along with the deal experience. I mean, you can't point to the prior 10 deals you've done until you do one. And I think that opportunity now you see is being brought to the forefront. And I think the one that I really noticed that worked pretty well was when private developers say, hey, I don't have to use this. I'm doing private development. I've got my local bank here, but I do want a tax abatement on this historic property for 5 years. And as a condition of freezing my taxes, I had to have minority participation for my contracting side. And so they wouldn't have usually been in that place because they weren't seeking federal dollars, but the economic development kind of pushed that as an incentive for some of those vehicles. So I think that's helped a lot.
Thanks, Ryan. Shannon, you have anything to share?
I would echo the statements. You know, starting our company as a women-owned development company was particularly challenging to raise the equity that we needed and look at the balance sheet for the type of projects that we were moving into. I would say that we're naturally intentional about keeping our development teams as diverse as possible because it's just something we believe in as an organization. But certainly more than ever, we're starting to see that, you know, there's local municipalities and our state agencies that are starting to adopt, whether it be through scoring mechanisms or priorities within RFPs and RFQs, certain priorities into creating a more diverse development team. But once again, it's something for us that, you know, every team that we look at, we look at from a holistic lens of how can we increase and make this as diverse as possible.
Thank you. So I'm going to also sort of stick with you for a second, Shannon. One of the things that we learned at Cincinnati Development Fund was that we were having so many younger or minority developers who could not scale because they could not get additional funding to go forward. So everything they've got is in one particular project, but if they had the opportunity to do something else, they don't have an equity to do that. So we did create a product for that. It's a line of credit that will support those kind of needs. And I think some of the things we learned here today is that no matter where you are, you're experiencing a lot of the same challenges. And there has to be a way to, figure out how to make that work no matter, where you are or whatever. So Shannon, I'd like to ask you just the final question here is, could you share some lessons that you've learned in this work that you're doing? And that's something that you'd like to share with the audience?
I think you provided a tremendous example. Through partnerships, everything's possible. And as we're starting to look at national organizations like IFF or Enterprise, I think, that there's a tremendous opportunity for, emerging developers, emerging minority developers to have resources that didn't exist before. And, I hope stories like yours encourage other local participants to broaden their policies. For us, one of our early projects, we were able to get guarantee support through a local foundation. And those were really the critical pieces of success, where you can bridge the gap of how do we move towards these tremendous initiative. And, our team has a long history in development, but, our first foray to say, listen, we're going to start our own development company was a big initiative. So I think, getting out there, telling the stories and hearing the examples of like what you did in Cincinnati is really, really critical. So we can hear other community groups to realize that this is something that can have tremendous impact to broaden the scope, to create, a bridge to more diverse developers moving forward, and certainly encourage everyone that's listening that just getting behind your local developer, providing a guarantee, and giving that one boost up can make all the difference in the world.
Ryan, could you share with us some of the lessons that you've learned as you go through this work and things that the audience might be able to take away with them to do what they want to do?
That was Ryan. That was for me. I'll jump in. For some reason, I lost you, Robbie, but I'll jump in here. I'll just echo once again, I think the policy and the coalitions and the that really does drive the opportunity. I think the more that's input into the planning for housing stock, the opportunities, getting behind the balance sheet, as Shannon mentioned, I think that creates it. I would not put any less emphasis on JV opportunities with larger developers and mandating that via the policy, via the incentives. And then, I think that is what kind of brings this full circle for the opportunity side. And then once you get into the actual development side, that same initiative and policy kind of drives cost cutting, and be that the permitting fees, the process, bonus density, things that really help give a little bit more juice to the development. And I learned that's where some value can be created. So I'm thankful for a lot of people that push behind the scenes that kind of make the opportunity possible via incentivizing the larger developers who might not have to go this route, or the small developers who need just a little bit extra boost behind them. And I think that can be done from the opportunity side, then actually the execution side once you get into the development. That's what it takes to get deals done at this point. So.
And Brian, so could you share with us a little bit about what you think are some lessons that you've learned through this process?
Yeah, sure. I really do love, since we're on the topic, I love the topic of relationship building and changing narratives too, about people and places, and in housing as a whole, and how it relates to equity and health, and trying to fill those gaps. I think we're all three different types of developers, but we're all part of the same goal as it relates to equity. And that's, I think, working in these communities and improving the lives of the residents as it relates to housing. And I look to this to, again, if I'm saying one thing, it is do not exclude landlords ultimately from this conversation. Here in Springfield, we have instituted a rental registry here, and there's going to be some pushes to really try to weed out what we consider to be slumlords. But you have to couple that with the fact that this is not a witch hunt against people renting properties. You also need to have, I love the idea in Springfield, there's many homes that were built as doubles as we were emerging from the Great Depression, for people trying to subsidize the costs. I love, if we're going to focus on home ownership, to maybe try to move folks into those properties and give them a segue into landlording and being active participants in the neighborhoods in which they're renting in. I love the concept of working with neighborhood associations and somewhat encouraging them to enter into that space as well, even if it's with short-term rental opportunities to come explore their historic neighborhood or traditional long-term rental properties. But I love the idea of bringing all of these groups to the table and trying to redefine what it means to be a landlord in these communities.
No, I thank you for that. I think that is an extremely important part of what we do, is to work with the landlords. And you had mentioned earlier about some of the properties that are just been in really bad shape, and there have been some bad actors in that space. I'm sure we all have that. We've had a considerable amount of that in Cincinnati, and we've had to, be creative in how we manage the process with them. So one question did come over. At the local level, we often see that development projects with more intensity, like a duplex versus a single family home, or having more units in a project, is capitalized as greedy, or the part of on the part of the developer. How should local housing advocates counter that argument? Anybody have any thoughts on that? Basically, I think what they're asking is developments that are, a duplex versus a single units, should having more units in a project is considered being greedy. So basically, do you take do you make more units out of a property than you need to do to make more money?
I'll jump in. I think public education is critical right now to understand the local dynamic and housing climate. And for the most part, in all the markets we're looking at, the cost of construction far exceeds the marketability, and the demand, as we see shifting demographics, decreasing households, is for a more diverse, mid-density product. And oftentimes, we can't pencil products without density, and there's multiple factors, from environmental sustainability to just demand on what's needed. And I think overall, the general public doesn't understand how challenging the housing dynamic is, and that we have a responsibility to house humans, and that this responsibility has impact to economic development, to local employers, to health and safety of the people living in their communities. And so we've got to be able to achieve this through the appropriate amount of density through the local neighborhoods, and being able to bring in the tools and resources that effectively gap these projects moving forward. And we can't grow our population. We can't be able to attract business and retain business, without a strategic housing plan. It's critical right now. And once again, the local communities don't know this. We really encourage any of the stakeholders to, be looking in advance to create local stakeholder meetings and appropriate communication that shows, what the impact is.
And I'll jump in as well. I think it has to just be done responsibly. I mean, we're not overcrowding, making the units much smaller. I think it does help with spreading costs. I think someone mentioned that earlier. When you've got an insurance or, trash, anything, maintenance on a site, having more units. I mean, there's even a certain point, kind of to Shannon mentioned, once it's under a certain amount of units, it becomes, not feasible, just in terms of these larger developments, based on how many units you can get out and the cost that it's going to take to get there. So having that bonus density for the workforce housing, affordable housing, or even just market rate, and just being responsible in how the deal is built, you can still get sizable units. It just may not meet the local zoning ordinance, and then you get a lot of pushback, and then the deal doesn't pencil out, so it never happens in totality. So I think not being irresponsible in terms of the actual unit sizing, but being able to get more density onto a site, whether it be taller or more mass, that's past whatever the zoning restrictions are. And sometime we've seen here locally that there is a bonus density for certain types of development, but that helps to spread the costs that are inevitable across the development anyway, and helps it to pencil out better.
Brian, I want to ask you specifically about some of the areas that you have, because you work in some historic areas. Is the density a concern for you there?
So, I always, this is a topic that comes up a lot, and I look at this from two perspectives. One is sustainability and affordable, and it applies to both the developer and the end user. So, I look at Springfield. Springfield used to be a much more dense place to begin with, and that's why we have so many doubles and quadplexes and things like that. Ultimately, you can kind of you could shift that dynamic and look at it as the homeowner or the tenant. A smaller footprint home, especially for people that are, basically struggling to get by, whether they're tenants or homeowners. And that is a vast portion of the residents of Springfield. We are a service and manufacturing economy. People, wages are down. We're in a weak market because our economy locally here is somewhat weak as it pertains to our laborers here. It's not what it was in the 50s and 60s and 70s. So I look at that, when these units are smaller and more dense, they're more affordable for the homeowners and the tenants that are in them to utility bills. If they're ultimately owning the properties, it's just less property to take care of. And honestly, as you look back and previously, again, the density was built there for a reason, and it was to be sustainable for both the homeowner, tenant, and the developers of the properties.
And you don't get any issues with maintaining the historical property look and feel? Are you still able to do what you need to do in that space?
Yeah, and I have some great examples, that I could share, but yes, and again, luckily here in Springfield, many of our, Victorians were doubles to begin with. So I am not actively in the business of taking a beautiful single family home and cutting it into units. But if it has already been done and it makes sense, especially in neighborhoods that may be a little bit lower income in nature, to me, it just makes sense for everybody that's there, bring back the aesthetics of the home, let it be set up and used in the way that makes the most sense for the neighborhood at the time. So.
Thank you, Brian. I'm not seeing any questions in the Q&A or in the chat, so I'm going to assume that there aren't any. Is there anything else that our panelists would like to share prior to us ending this webinar? Not seeing anything. I want to really heartily thank you all for being here today and providing your expertise. This has been a very interesting conversation, and I again thank you for your time today. We will have this available for you later in a webinar. You will get the link to the webinar. We would also like to thank our partner, Lincoln Institute and Land Policy, for the support on the developing series. So thank you all. We appreciate your time and have a great Tuesday. Bye-bye.